All right, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Deal in the Cards podcast. We're short Josh and Andrew today, but I'm here for you guys. And then, as always, we're joined by some exciting guests. So we've got Jeff Jones of the Belleville News-Democrat. He's a beat writer for the Cardinals. He's got really good stuff. Go check it out. And then Thomas Gavain, who writes for Redbird Rants, friend of the show. He has great stuff on Twitter, so you should go check his content out as well. Today, we've got a loaded episode, lots of stuff to talk about. We've got options getting picked up in the next few days. We've got an exciting World Series that may be a little more exciting now that the Yankees finally did something and won a game, and we'll get into all of that up next here. So let's get straight into it. World Series, super relevant. Obviously, it's going on right now. Crazy moment from the other night. Jeff, what was your reaction when the Yankees fan interfered with Mookie Betts? What'd you think of that?
You can't do that. That's like at the number one top of the list of stuff that you absolutely cannot do. I thought that I understand the guy trying to catch the ball that's coming in his direction. That's fine. You can't grab the ball player by the wrist and try to pry the glove open. Like there's nothing good that's going to happen out of that. I think those guys are probably pretty lucky that they got kicked out and not arrested last night. I think that they're probably pretty lucky that they are getting their money back for their tickets and not being allowed to come as opposed to it being confiscated. I think all told that this is probably becoming a larger story than it needed to be, in part because it has not been a super interesting series otherwise. And this is kind of the first thing for folks to grab onto, right? So I am if not eager to not have to talk about the guys in the stands anymore, but I'm certain that like when their podcast starts in 8 days or whatever, that they'll make, hundreds of dollars with it.
Yeah, crazy moment. I honestly couldn't believe they weren't like ejected for life. I can't believe they're going to be coming back. It's honestly insane. And the Yankees are kind of supporting it behind the scenes, which I think is a little strange.
If I were the Dodgers, I would not be real thrilled about that. And clearly, like you could see Aaron Boone in his pregame today was also not real thrilled about the tenor that this whole thing is taken. So maybe they let it die off. And look, they could lose the game tonight and it becomes relevant anyway. So
true. Thomas, has anything stuck out to you this series?
No, not so much. It's been a little bit less exciting than I thought it would be. Definitely, I thought the Yankees would give them a little bit more of a run for their money, but you never quite know. Garrett Cole's on the mound tonight, so something great could happen for the Yankees, and someone is bound to come back from a 3-0 deficit. Why not this year?
Yeah, it'll be eventually. I think the only time it's happened in baseball is the 2004 ALCS, Red Sox over Yankees, right? So pretty crazy. Well, this World Series, thankfully, it's going to end soon. And when it does, things will start getting more exciting for the Cardinals. But there's stuff to break down right now. We've talked about it a little bit on the show, but we're really excited to get Jeff and Thomas's perspective here. The Cardinals have made some huge front office moves since the season ended. We're going to start by breaking down the Cerfolio hire. So, Jeff, if you want to give us a little background on that and then tell us kind of what you think that means for the organization. And then we'll get into the juicier stuff, including big transitions up high with Chaim Bloom. So let's get into Cerfolio here.
I think big picture with Cerfolio, the thing that stands out to me is that the Cleveland development system has obviously generated a number of useful big league players for that team, right? But crucially, it's a steady pipeline of guys who can contribute. They maybe have not turned out the kind of top end talent in the last, say, 5 to 8 to 10 years that you would hope for out of your system, but they have been pretty consistent about feeding it. I think the other thing with Cerfolio that really stands out to me is that when you kind of look at the background on the guys the Cardinals are leading on now to reshape the system, right? You're talking about Bloom, we're talking about Rob Cerfolio. These are guys who came from jobs where the prime directive was to maximize the output for the minimal dollar, right? Like you can maybe quibble with that with Bloom in Boston, but the reason he got hired in Boston was because of what he did and what he done in Tampa. And there clearly is a desire to replicate that in St. Louis. The conversation around this sort of wind back and payroll that we're seeing has been, when the team is ready for it, the money will be there and they can return to levels. We'll see. People say that, and then all of a sudden they don't always ever climb back that level, right? So in 2, 3, 5 years, whatever it is, we'll see if the Cardinals are again, a $200, a $220, $250 million payroll team, or if they're Cleveland and in 5 years they're still at like 115 and we're all looking around going, where'd all the money go?
That would be so tough. I really hope the Cardinals don't commit to spending less. But yeah, you're right. I think something that's gone underreported is the Diamond Sports Group bankruptcy, what it means for the Cardinals. I don't think fans understand the amount of lost revenue they're projecting. I know this is a bit off topic here, but I've seen some crazy numbers. And when you think about it that way, numbers in excess of $100-200 million of projected lost revenue over the next several years, it makes sense to cut spending. It just really stinks that has to happen right now with all the other things going on PR wise for the team.
It does. I do want to highlight though, Dan Caesar, who covers media for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, had a story last week, or maybe the beginning of this week, about kind of the possibilities here that come out of this Diamond situation, part of which being restructuring. Their reporting has suggested that rights fees for this year would be somewhere like 75 to 78 million, right? The reporting in that story said that Diamond, if they were to restructure for this year, would be talking about like a 20% reduction in what they would be paying. So two things can be true, right? Like a 20% reduction in the expected rights fee is about, they call it 15 million bucks, 15 to 17 million bucks that they would be cutting back. But it's right. It's not, it's, over a year-to-year basis, I'm not entirely sure that like a $15 million dip in cash flow, that frankly, the ownership group can't just beat that, right? As an investment for the future, that is not so large a number. We look at year-over-year revenues in the, according to the Forbes reporting, the revenue, the gross revenue is something in the neighborhood of like 375 per year, right? You take all the expenditures out of that, obviously, but there will be a decrease in revenue for sure, but it will be temporary, and I don't think it's going to be quite as apocalyptic. It's all on how you frame it, right? Yeah. In theory, if they were to avoid the Bally deal, it's true that they could show a drop of 150 million that they were expecting to get in cash over the next couple of years. But the accounting is always creative with stuff like that, right? So my plea, my ongoing thing for Cardinals fans here over the next couple of years is going to be, when they say they can't afford something, you should make them show their work, because it is probably not very likely that they will be able to do so, because that's sort of how this works, right? That is sort of how these teams are run.
Yeah, absolutely. Thomas, you want to weigh in here?
Yeah, I think so. You mentioned the RSN situation. The next level on top of that, you said it's a perfect storm. The attendance at games too is definitely going to hurt. It's not so much as like the RSN and those other things that are generating tens of millions of dollars a year, but you get a drop in average of 5,000 people per game, if not more. They're going to start feeling that too. So I think that all these causes are giving them, the DeWitt family, more reason to say, "Oh, we're cutting back on money." We've all seen their net worth and the revenues that Jeff talked about. They don't necessarily need to do those things. Whether they want to or not, that's their own prerogative. They own the team. They can do as they choose. So fans need to keep both those things in mind.
And the other variable that I think that is fair to remember here, right, is that they are going to be doing a significant overhaul of the facility in Jupiter. That is going to be a big capital outlay up front. We're talking about maybe $110 million project, of which they're responsible. So it's 110 all in for the facility. So we're talking about 55 on the Cardinals side. There is public money involved in that as well. And again, you don't have to spend 55. Like, these guys can amortize that over the length of a project, right? There are a number of things that go into that. That is going to that will be a significant capital outlay for sure. But it also increases the value of the franchise and increases the value of that parcel of real estate, and there is public money. So there is give and take, but I do think that expenditure is a significant one that we should talk about. That doesn't really hard for people to wrap their minds around, just because it's not maybe as visible as the payroll stuff might be.
And if you look at just the contracts that are coming off the books this year, the players that are leaving, assuming they don't get their options picked up, that can offset the $55 million that the club is looking to input. So even if it's just a 1 year, we're cutting back finances because of the RSN, because of the pitching lab, that's fine. But if ownership continues to use these lines 2-3 years down the road, like you were mentioning, that's where fans might want to start getting a little bit questioning.
That would be a concern.
100%. Yeah, we'll talk about trade candidates and stuff and getting money off the books later in this episode, so stay tuned. But quick math for me shows that the Cardinals could, in theory, shed $60-70 million from the payroll without too much difficulty this offseason. So yeah, you're absolutely right, Jeff. If they do that and they don't augment the roster with increased spending in the next few years, fans definitely should be frustrated with ownership there. But there's a lot of restructuring going on with payroll, also within the front office itself. We talked about Cerfolio. He's a hire that gets us excited. The Cardinals are clearly going more into data-driven analysis. They're trying to modernize, get with the times, and really update their players' development system. But there's also a top-down change coming, and that's the addition of Chaim Bloom to this front office. It's been talked about ad nauseum in the Cardinal space, but we really want to get your takes on this, guys. So let's just jump straight to Jeff. What do you think Chaim Bloom means to this organization? How big a change is this going to be for the Cardinals?
The really interesting thing about the process of turning the franchise over to Chaim Bloom is that it's really a repeat of what the DeWitts attempted to do 20 years ago when they hired Jeff Luhnow, right? Jeff's first year was spent largely as a consultant, kind of auditing the system and proposing changes he would have made. The difference, the issue as it turned out, was that Jeff was interpersonally unpleasant and people didn't like him in the office. And so it was hard for him to run things, right? That is not the case with Chaim, who carries a lot of respect as well as being like generally pleasant in ways that I understand Jeff Luhnow not to be. So, when you kind of look at the process here, to me, and I can remember Peter Gammons, God bless him, legendary Peter Gammons, likes to tweet at like 4 a.m. Peter gets up super early, clearly has his coffee and his paper, and just like does his thoughts, right? And I can remember being up very early and reading a Peter Gammons tweet last November about Chaim Bloom coming to the Cardinals as a consultant or something. And at that moment, I went, "Oh, he's taking over." It's just such a natural way that this team does business. I think when you were evaluating what it looks like for him to run the franchise, I think that I'm tempted for me to give him mostly a mulligan on how Boston turned out, because he gets to Boston, there is a pandemic, he has to trade Mookie Betts, he has to staple David Price to Mookie Betts in that deal as part of mandate from ownership. So you're talking about you have to be able. The return for Mookie Betts was bad. That's a bad trade for Boston, right? You can't trade Mookie Betts and win a trade, but that was a bad trade even by the standards of how we might measure those things, right? Like worse probably even than the Arenado deal was for Colorado. But it had to be a team where Betts wanted to sign and that could take David Price's money and that Price would agree to go. I don't know if that list has 3 teams on it. So there was not a lot that could be done there. And that sort of overshadowed everything that happened for Bloom in Boston after that, right? So it's really hard, I think, for me to really evaluate what that looks like. I think there are lessons for him that came out of that we are already seeing kind of be acted upon in St. Louis, right? I think that, the structure where he is going to have another year with a sort of nebulous advisor title and then take over kind of coincides with, if somebody's going to have to be the Reaper and be responsible for sending guys out of town, it's going to be John Mozeliak, right? We're going to talk about the guys they might trade later, but if this does become a more tear down looking situation, then it's Mozeliak, who has to eat all of that. He's going to be the guy whose name is going to be on a lot of those trades and not, if you're Chaim Bloom, what you don't want to do is again get to a new situation and again have to trade the team's most important players. So I do think that is maybe an interesting lesson that came out of that. I think also we'll sort of see what the Cardinals want to do in terms of empowering the people under him. What have the Cardinals learned from the Mozeliak experience and the way that he became the sort of unitary executive at the front of everything they did? Do they want a different model? I think that's something that we should consider as well. And that together, we'll see. Look, from what I know of Chaim Bloom, he's an extraordinarily smart guy who understands how the business works and who spent a lot of time in Tampa doing a pretty good job of squeezing $1 or $2 out of $1, right? And we'll see what that looks like here, where in theory there should be more financial support, there should be better logistics support. We'll see if ownership provides him that and if he's able to execute it on a way that he was kind of, limited from doing so in Boston.
Yeah, let's get your take here, Thomas.
Yeah, Jeff hit it all pretty well on the head there. I think the other part of the benefit of Chaim Bloom coming in is it replaces a stale front office group.
Absolutely.
Mozeliak's coming into his 18th season. He was on the forefront of things for the first decade of his time here, and he started to fade as time has passed. And so Chaim Bloom, even with his successful track record, he's bringing in a different face, a different voice, a different way of doing things in the organization, which should bode pretty well. His Tampa Bay experience will be beneficial because he has that player development acumen plus another X amount of dollars that he didn't have in Tampa to fill in the gaps and fill in the holes. The one thing I am very interested in, and we touched on it with Cerfolio, is who Bloom brings in beneath him.
Yeah.
He's going to bring in a whole bunch of smart guys outside the organization who know what they're doing. And that should also continue to bring these fresh faces and this different way of doing things. It should benefit the organization from all levels. It'll start at the bottom, obviously, and then it'll work its way up with prospects and development, and then eventually spending will come as the icing on top.
Yeah, absolutely. It's definitely worth talking about how Bloom, I guess, improved player development in Boston. He wasn't part of the team that developed Mookie Betts, but the number one overall prospect in the league, according to a lot of outlets, Roman Anthony, that's a Bloom drafted guy. I know Bloom was part of the reason they drafted Marcelo Meyer, who's viewed really highly around the industry. So there's a ton of guys in Boston, around Boston. And then we can see Bloom's fingerprints on some deals the Cardinals have made as well. I do believe that he had a lot of influence in acquiring, for example, Ryan Fernandez in the Rule 5 draft from Boston. I think Bloom's fingerprints were all over some of the bullpen moves that were made this year, and the bullpen was one of the strong suits for the Cardinals this season, obviously. I believe that's where the team got a lot of its value. So there's already a lot to like. I think he's a really great developer. I do wonder, like you pointed out, Jeff, that there were concerns about what happened in Boston. I really hope Bloom doesn't end up in a situation like that. That would just be a lose-lose for everyone involved. An owner coming out publicly saying, we're going to trade this guy, telling him you've got to trade a really bad contract along with it. And there is a way to see him being forced to make an unpopular move early on in his tenure here. Is that part of the reason, though, that perhaps Mozeliak is staying on another year to oversee some of these guys moved out? Do you think there's a chance that they're trying to say, okay, if the Cardinals are going to trade Sonny Gray or Nolan Arenado, guys that are really popular, you see a lot of those jerseys at the ballpark. You see a ton of Arenados at the ballpark, right? If they're going to trade that guy, are they trying to say, okay, you know what, let's just pin this on Mo on his way out so Bloom really gets a fresh slate? Do you think there's something there?
I do think there is something to that. I don't think that's the entire reason. Look, I mean, Mozeliak had another year on his contract, for better or worse, carries a ton of cachet with the ownership group. You know, they are wrapped around each other, and you know, so the idea that he was going to be fired, like flat fired, that was there. I don't know when we reached a point where that was never going to be possible, save for some sort of like workplace scandal, right? But it was years ago. Like it's been a long time now that they were never going to just let Mozeliak go in a kind of undignified sort of way. So, you know, it's clearly, I think, time for him. He definitely knows it's time for him. I think there are parts of the job that he is pretty tired of doing, pretty tired of dealing with. I think that an underrated part of, you know, the pandemic for sure took a lot out of him in terms of what running the franchise looked like through that. Some of that was self-inflicted in, you know, in some of the choices they made about how they were going to do messaging and yada, yada, yada. But I do think there is something to, you know, as you mentioned, if you are going to trade all these guys, if you are going to be, you know, if you're going to be responsible for trading any or all of Arenado and Gray and Contreras, if you're going to let Paul Goldschmidt walk for nothing, all these things that do matter, I do think there is benefit to putting that on Mozeliak's ledger on the way out the door and letting Bloom have a relatively fresh slate.
I think the other part of it too is with all the changes that are coming in player development personnel, to have the two faces, I guess you could say, of both the front office and the game side of it, and Mozeliak and Marmol remaining, there's that sense of constancy for those who are staying. You can't have everything go kaput in one offseason and expect to put it back together and at least be semi-competitive in the next year, regardless of who's on the roster. So having both those guys there, it's expectations that the players are familiar with, and even some of the front office staff are familiar with too, because they've worked with these people for 3+ years.
Yeah, there's just a ton of transition in the organization, and that extends not just to the front office, but also to the major league coaching staff, where we've seen some big moves already. Turner Ward was let go. I say thank goodness. I think his tenure in St. Louis was really disappointing. Definitely not my favorite. Really wish we could have Jeff Albert back, but that ship has sailed, obviously. The Cardinals bring in Brant Brown, if I'm saying that correctly. His resume is not incredible. Just going to get into that background really quickly. So he was fired in Seattle in May of this year. Seattle's offense really stinks. Seattle's kind of a weird place, though. Hitters go there. It doesn't always work out. You look at guys like Jesse Winker, for example, that have a lot of success before Seattle. They get there. It's really bad. I know Teoscar Hernandez this year coming out of Seattle said something along the lines of the batter's eye there is really, really hard. It's bad. He says he can't pick up the ball, and he thinks there'll be changes in the near future, which potentially could make things better. So I know it's not just the Mariners that struggle to hit at T-Mobile Park. It's everybody, but it could also be that the Mariners have a good pitching staff. So there's that concern. So Brown, kind of a weird hire for the Cardinals. And then also John Jay was added to the staff. We'll get into him later. Jeff, let's get your take on Brown. Should Cardinals fans be excited about this guy? Does it matter? Is it a big thing? Is he here long-term, or is this just really temporary?
I think this will not sound flattering. I don't mean it to be non-flattering, but I look at Brant Brown as kind of like a replacement level major league hitting coach, right? Like I think that there are probably like 14 guys who are big league hitting coaches who are basically the same as Brant Brown. And I would maybe include Turner Ward in that crew, depending. And part of it is after a while the message gets stale and a fresh voice happens. Look, hitting coaches get fired. This happens a lot. It's sort of they seem to be the most fireable of all coaches among all big league staffs, right? It's a bad era for hitters. Hitting coaches are going to eat it. The thing about Seattle this year, I will say, is that for Brown to be hired over the winter and then to be fired by the end of May and then hired again immediately, right? That whatever it was like a Seattle specific situation, and it just really wasn't working out. The one thing I have heard about him is that he's relatively hard driving. He will get on guys. He barks a little, has a little bit of an edge to him in that kind of old school coach mentality kind of way. Turner really wasn't that guy. Like Turner, much more like a rah-rah kind of guy than a getting on players kind of guy. So, who knows? You go from the good cop to the bad cop. Maybe it makes a difference. Is he here for the long term? Probably not, because he's a hitting coach. What's the long term? Is it 5? Like if he's here for 5 years, that's like a really long term job for a hitting coach, right? I think ultimately what it comes down to is he's a guy who you trust to communicate with your development staff. I'm sure that part of the conversation with him is, what is your collaboration with Russ Steinhorn going to look like? I'm sure that there were probably discussions about kind of, that integration stuff, right? Like, one thing that I know that throughout the year is that the Cardinals had their minor league hitting coaches basically rotate up a week at a time to spend some time around the big league club and to spend some time around Turner to make sure that the messaging was consistent day in and day out, and they were kind of explaining things the same way, right? The contrast there is that Dusty Blake every week has a call with the minor league pitching coaches where all of them are together at the same time. And, when talking about it, that was sort of described as just a difference in management style between Dusty and Turner, right? And that's fine. But the pitching staff outperformed the hitting staff by a pretty significant margin. And I think that we saw some pretty significant strides taken in pitching development even last year throughout the organization, right? So I would not be surprised if maybe they were like, well, we like the Dusty version better. So can we, right? There are always things like that kind of crop up. And part of that is just, for all we talk about baseball being a business, like there is something to different guys like different kind of bosses. And, there is a literal like business communication aspect to this. Turner worked hard, lived and died with their success, but there was not a lot of success. So this is what happens to hitting coaches.
Yeah, that's fair. Thomas, are you excited about the hires or anything that gets you jazzed up, or is it kind of a bummer? Right?
Yeah, the replacement hitting coach was a good line there. That just kind of feels like what Brant Brown's going to do. His time with the Dodgers seemed to go well. The Marlins are just a bad offensive team, but he led them to an average year in 2023. And then last year with the Mariners felt like a bit of an anomaly and an unfair shot. He was there for 3 months, booted out, and then brought back in 4 months later with a different team. So I don't know if that's necessarily indicative of who he is as a coach or his success. I, too, have heard a lot, like Jeff said, about how he relates to players, and maybe it's just bad taste with those in Seattle. So go ahead, Jeff.
No, and I was going to say, too, the other thing about Brown is that he did, and Mozeliak was asked directly, he came with a throwing recommendation from Skip Schumacher. It was a guy who was on Skip's staff in Miami and a guy who Skip liked and was willing to stick his neck out for Mozeliak, but was willing to recommend it to Mozeliak. So that's a guy whose opinion still carries a lot of weight around here, and he spoke up for him. So, I'm sure that helped.
Yeah, Skip Schumacher. Oh, you go first, and then I'll jump in.
Let's also remember we have 2 former 2023 Marlins coaches on our team, so we just need the third to complete the triumvirate.
Absolutely. I was going to say, Skip Schumacher is a great way to jump into the John Jay discussion. Another former player now becoming a coach. The Cardinals have added him to the big league staff. I know there's some sort of stench PR-wise around former Cardinals. And I think that's kind of a bummer. It feels like every time the Cardinals bring someone in who was related to the team in some capacity before, they say, oh, this is just more of the Mo era. This is just them trying to get butts in seats. This guy doesn't deserve the job. And I think that is problematic because I think you're ruling out guys that actually have really great baseball minds. I know John Jay comes highly recommended. A lot of people are excited about him as a baseball mind. I know some people think he could manage a team someday, so it's a really good thing for the Cardinals to have him early on in his career as a coach. But do you think this is a move to drum up publicity, or is this really like a smart baseball move? The Cardinals are trying to make their staff better by adding John Jay.
I think it's a move that's sort of premised around if Willie McGee was ready to take a step back, if the travel got to be a little too much for him, whatever, right? Who can you go get that's on the market that basically does the Willie McGee stuff, right? And John Jay, never a National League MVP, never the heights of the player that Willie was, certainly for nearly as long a time. But you can see the similarity in that, it's an outfielder with high defensive skill, a guy who's real relatable, easy to deal, right? Like, there's a lot of stuff about John Jay that sort of, that kind of feels similar from a coaching perspective, and a guy who has experience, right? Has been a major league first base coach, has done some work with the University of Miami. So not a surprise at all. And the other thing too is I think it's fair to be a little skeptical of, the requirement for connections and some of that familiarity. But John Jay was also a Cardinal through like one of the best stretches in franchise history, right? Has a ring here, played on that 2013 World Series team, was on a 100-win team. So, if you're looking at, okay, how do the Cardinals want to bring back in guys who have, what we talk about as that mythical Cardinal way, right? Guys who came up, developed through the system, and then made it to the big leagues. Jay and Descalso, these are guys who did that and had like legitimate success with it, as opposed to guys who have just sort of like been around.
I'd agree with that. And I also think it's hard to say that they're trying to get fans excited about a role like a bench coach. It's not like they're bringing in Albert as the manager, although I'm not saying that's not possible. And I think it is possible that Albert manages the team in the future, maybe not the near future, but they're not doing that kind of move. Like John Jay is not going to be super visible. He's probably going to do a lot more work behind the scenes. He could be in the dugout, but no one's coming to the ballpark because John Jay is suddenly in the dugout. I think people reacting to that, it's kind of overblown.
Yeah, and he's not like in the marketing material. They're not selling a John Jay. There's not going to be a John Jay bobblehead day. Yeah, it helps. Look, it helps to know people. Again, like any other business, if you know the boss and have a good relationship, it helps. That's not that's useful and good for John Jay for finding himself in a spot where he does. And he's a qualified big league coach who will teach dudes how to catch fly balls and where to stand in the outfield. That's a useful skill, right?
At the moment.
And they're bringing on a guy who had success in his career at a time when the organization had success, and he's familiar with the organization itself still. It's not as though they're bringing Jeremy Hazelbaker back to be the outfield coach. Like, and with all the and with all the young guys coming up, Victor Scott II, he needs somebody to help him with routes and reads off the bat. And John Jay could do just that. He was a plus defender for his career. He's familiar with Busch Stadium and how it operates.
And crucially, and Jay played in the big leagues 3 years ago, right? We heard 2 winters ago about the challenges they had with having coaches who hadn't really been able to relate to players based on their playing career, i.e. Jeff Albert. And so they were like, okay, well, let's go hire a bunch of guys who have that experience. John Jay, for sure, has recent significant big league experience.
And you hear about other guys, John Mabry, former Cardinal, who's having success with coaching in the minor leagues. These are guys who had they have a resume. They're good coaches. It's not just like, oh, he played for us X amount of years ago. Let's bring him back to see what magic he can bring. That's possible, but they're also real coaches with some skill sets behind them.
Yeah, 100%. I think it's a good move for the Cardinals. It's probably a move that'll bring them success. And if you need to bring success to your farm, Smith Agri-Service is a family-owned independent retailer providing farmers in Missouri, Illinois, and Iowa with competitive pricing on Corteva, BASF generic brand crop production products, and Brevant corn and soybean seed. Scan the QR code right here. It'll be up for the rest of the show. Or text 202-988-1106. That's 202-988-1106, or email smithag@irtc.net. And then also here, we've got our presenting sponsor, 314 Sports Cards. 314 Sports Cards is located at 9640, that's 9640 Olive Boulevard in Olivet, Missouri. They're open 10 to 5 Monday through Friday and 9 to 4 on Saturday. They've partnered with us on a number of occasions. They're really, really great. If you're interested in trading cards, 314 buys, sells, and trades all sorts of sports cards, Pokemon cards, really anything you're looking for. They have the newest selection of packs, boxes, and single cards of local players and stars from around the league. They're really fantastic. Go in, spend some money in the store, tell them we sent you. They love to support this, so we'd love to support them back as well. Sometimes they give Andrew packs to open on air. He's gotten addicted to trading cards since we've developed this relationship with them. So it's really a great thing. But seriously, go check them out. Check out Smith Ag Service as well. Thank you guys so much for sponsoring the show. So our next segment here, we're going to get out of kind of the nitty gritty of the front office and the coaching staff. And instead, we're going to jump into the on-field product. So the Cardinals have 5 days to decide on options for Lynn and Gibson. They're going to have to either pick those up or decline them. I believe both options are slightly lower than the salaries those players made this year. I think both are pretty close to what market value would be for those players this offseason. Maybe Lynn's is a little higher, but basically they have a few days to decide whether they want to have those pitchers again next year or dump them. So we're just going to start with Jeff here. Jeff, do you think the Cardinals are going to pick those options up, or are they going to say, walk into the sunset, we'll see you guys the next time?
So it is 5 days from the end of the World Series, right? So
okay, so they have a couple more days.
Right. If it's 5 days when the Dodgers win tonight, if it's not, then off we go. So I think there are three guys who have team options that come with decisions, right? It's Lance Lynn with $1 million buyout. It's Kyle Gibson who has $1 million buyout, and then it's Keenan Middleton, who I'd have to look, but I'm pretty sure it's $500,000 to buy out Middleton, and the $6 million that's left on his deal. Of those, they're not going to pick up Lynn's option. I think that there is some question as to how healthy Lance ended the season. I think that there is some concern that right knee might need surgery, and if it does, is Lynn at a point in his career where he wants to do that, right? He has not said that he is retiring. He was asked at the end of the year if he was done, and he said, well, I'm always going to want to say I want to keep pitching, but ... So we'll see. Middleton, I don't expect him to pick up that option either. There is a possibility they could sign him for a smaller number. I believe the team option is for $6. It would not totally shock me if they were to come to him, with, let's call it 3 or 4 or something of that, something to make, or maybe even the 5 that he got this year, right? Something like that, just in terms of being a body and arm and, a guy they can use and could be retrade at the deadline. Not certain that Middleton would be interested in that. They really liked him this year behind the scenes. He was around the team the entire. It would have been easy enough for him to just stay in Florida and rehab and the hell with it, but was around the team all year long doing his work and really did benefit a lot of guys. If you went to games, right, you could sort of see him pregame a lot. Would be hanging out in the bullpen while starters are warming up. All of that, So we'll see. The bottom line is that for a team that is paring down salary, $5 million relievers are probably not going to be real high on their priority list, but who knows? Gibson is the interesting one. I know that there are people in the organization, definitely people on the coaching staff, who are really strongly in favor of them picking up Kyle Gibson's option, again, for what he meant behind the scenes to that staff this year, for the way that he kind of, filled in there. And also, frankly, because Kyle Gibson gave them exactly the season that you would have thought that Kyle Gibson would have given them, right? Like 170 innings of a 4.4 ERA or something close to that. He gave you a Kyle Gibson-ass season. He just did. And there is benefit to being able to sort of pencil that in, even for a team that maybe is not going to be a World Series contender. There is real benefit to being able to rely on that, because the thing that we saw in 2023, the Cardinals got to a point where they just didn't have the innings internally to finish the season. That is why Jacob Barnes and Casey Lawrence and Andrew Suarez and those guys all pitched down the stretch, right? You do have to play 162 games next year. And if you're the Cardinals, I think the possibility of going into the season with, 3 guys in the rotation who have fewer than 50 big league starts, that's tough. That's a really tough way to get through a season, let alone, be in a positive competitive environment. The one thing about picking up the Gibson option, I do think that if they do pick it up, it will probably be a pretty good indication that they feel like they're going to be able to get traction on some of their starting pitching in the trade market. Because I don't think, I do not expect them, I would not expect them to go into camp with us knowing who the 5 starters are. I would expect us to, expect them to go into camp with us thinking, here are probably 4 of the guys or 3 of the guys, and here are 3 guys for the other spots, and sort of seeing how that shakes out. That to me is closer to the kind of stuff that they have talked about doing. And when you look at the guys that they have under contract, they have a major league rotation under contract done, signed, sealed, delivered today, even before Gibson, really, right? And so if they were to bring him back, there is a real, there is some diminishing return on the innings they do want to see guys get. And so to me, if they exercise the Gibson option, it shows that they are very confident they're going to be able to move on from 1, 2, 3 other starters.
Yeah, absolutely. You said it right there. The Cardinals have a lot of big league starters under contract. Whether all of them are viable options for a team that maybe wants to win 85 games next year and potentially contend for a 3rd wildcard spot, we can get into that another time, is still up in the air, obviously. Those guys, let me know if I'm missing anybody, but from what I can think of, you've got Fetty, Matz, Michaelis, potentially Palante, Gray, and that's 5 right there. If you bring back Gibson, right, that's a 6th. And then you're obviously not giving opportunities to guys like McGreevy, who really shined in the limited chances he got this year, or maybe a Quinn Matthews, who the Cardinals shouldn't expect to contribute early in the year, but by August, there's every chance that a fast mover like him is ready to help the big league club. So you need to build in opportunities for these guys. The other thing, though, the flip side of that is last year, the Cardinals got pretty lucky with their pitching staff in terms of injuries, right? Like Matz missed the whole season, whatever. Steven Matz is always hurt. I feel terrible for the guy. I've been one of his biggest supporters as a Cardinal. But at this point, you just got to be sick of it as a Cardinals fan. Aside from that, though, Sonny Gray missed a couple starts at the beginning. They shut him down at the end because you can't have him get hurt. Aside from that, Michaelis pitched almost all season. When they got Fetty, he was reliable. Lance Lynn, Kyle Gibson. Lynn missed a couple of starts. I think he had a short IL stint at some point in the middle of the year. Yeah. Kyle Gibson was super reliable. These guys pitched all year. You never know if that's going to happen again next year. And it's unlikely that it does happen again. I think it's much more likely that you have more injuries. So maybe the Cardinals do need to build in some depth. But I think you're absolutely right. I believe that if they bring back Gibson, they have to trade one of those guys because you have to have Andre Palante in the rotation. I just don't think they could justify not having Andre Palante in the rotation. He was the team's best starter from early June on. I know Sonny Gray had the big gaudy strikeout numbers, but Andre Palante had the lowest ERA of any starter on the team after June 17th or something. So you have to have him in the rotation.
I think bringing Gibson. Go ahead, Jeff. Go ahead.
No. I was just going to say that they plan for Palante to be in the rotation. If he's healthy, he's in the rotation. He's got a spot.
And bringing Gibson back is insurance in 3 different ways. 1, injuries. He's a 170-plus inning guy. Yep. Pretty much every year you can count on it. 2, it's insurance for trades. It opens up the opportunity to get Matz or Michaelis or even both out if we can find deals. And then 3 is insurance for the young guys. If Palante deserves a spot, I'd say even McGreevy.
I hope he gets a spot,
or at least a high chance coming out of spring training. And then you've got guys like Zach Thompson, who's been sitting in AAA for X amount of years, and Gordon Graceffo. They probably deserve a shot in spring training. If they can prove their worth, that's fine. But if they're not there, and we've already dumped Michaelis and Matz, then we've got Gibson there as a solid 4 or 5 starter at the bottom of the rotation to really lift up the floor of it.
There, something that at the end of the year that we joked about a couple of times that I think, though, is kind of indicative of why 23 went off the rails so badly. If you look at 2023, they gave 40 starts to a collection of 3 guys who last year got DFA'd by the White Sox, Pirates, and Rockies, and also Adam Wainwright, who was the worst pitcher in Major League Baseball, like by far. He was hurt. He blew his shoulder out in spring. He was hurt, right? But it was 40 starts of Woodford, Hudson, and Wainwright, and it was just unwatchable. It was a bad environment for everyone. That's not conducive to development. It's not conducive to fans. You can't
and Drew Rom
have, like, and right, and Drew Rom did not pitch well either, right? So there has to be like a line of competency, even just to get through the season. Otherwise, like, you're the White Sox, right? And ask the White Sox how that went for them this year.
Yeah,
like,
absolutely.
There's rebuilding and there's being the White Sox, and you can't be the White Sox.
No, that's so true. And even when the Cardinals, like 2023 is so unique because the Cardinals have had times like 2020, right? They had to play like 57 games in 45 days or something stupid like that. Yeah. And they were putting Johan Oviedo out on a big league mound roughly every 6 days. Oviedo was not a big league pitcher in 2020. He was not ready to contribute. It was clear. And he was struggling every time out. He never pitched 5 innings. He recorded 0 wins that season. I know wins aren't a great stat, but it was just really hard to watch him go out there and get shelled. It wasn't even his fault. But the Cardinals doing that, like, he was the only guy who they were doing that to. When you look at 2023, like you said, it was a combination of at least 3 guys, sometimes at the same time in this rotation, where the Cardinals were doing that, where it was just like, it's one thing to have a loser at the back of your rotation, like you're losing his game. It's another thing to have 3 of those guys sprinkled in. It just cannot happen. So you're right.
Because it burns up your bullpen. There are a million things that happen downstream from that. My favorite little 2020 pitching story, on one of those days, whether they're playing doubleheaders and they were DFAing 6 guys in a day, and it was just getting the roster moving.
Bad. Yeah.
There was a righty reliever named Jesus Cruz who had been in spring camp that year, who was not picked for the alternate site. But when everyone got COVID, they basically put the phone call out and said, "Are you healthy and can you get to St. Louis?" And Jesus Cruz showed up and he got selected one day. And I asked Mike Schilt on a Zoom what he'd been doing since spring. And Schilt just got this look and he goes, "Gosh, I don't know." And I said, "You know what, man, like," because he didn't. Jesus Cruz and Ryan Meisinger and Rob Kaminsky, there were a bunch of guys who would just, it was what it was. That is though, like, it is instructive because they do make you play the games. You do have to literally put guys on the mound and throw the ball. You can't, like, you watched Brent Honeywell throw 50 pitches in an inning in a World Series game last night. You can't have that happen 60 times throughout the season. It's like, it just doesn't work.
Absolutely. And the weird part, though, is like the Cardinals have had times like this before. 2020 is obviously a great example, but there were times, especially like 2016 through 2018, even in some of the years where the Cardinals made the playoffs like they did in 2020, where it really just felt like they were cobbling stuff together. Like there have been guys on these teams that have no business being on these teams, and those teams have contended. But 2023 was just unique because it was so much of it and it was so bad. And I do think there's risk for this upcoming season that could happen again if the Cardinals don't bring back some of this veteran pitching. If they were to ship off, like, I think in my perfect world, I would like to see them move all of the veteran pitching that they can move, because I don't want to see Miles Mikolas. I don't really want to watch Kyle Gibson. I definitely don't want to watch Steven Matz next year. But if you do that, there's risk that you have a 2023 repeat where instead of just having 1 or 2 guys and it kind of works, you've got 4 or 5 guys that shouldn't be on the roster. And all of a sudden everything goes off the rails.
I think from an aesthetic standpoint as well, fans would be happier to see Miles Mikolas off the team than on the team. It's not going to do much at the turnstiles, but seeing these young guys and presenting the team as this is the future, see them, they're going to be here for 5 years, rather than here's Miles Mikolas again for the 30th time this year, for the 5th straight year. Like, fans are getting kind of tired of that stuff too. So having just a couple of these veterans, Fedde, Gray, Gibson, as your solid foundation of a starting rotation, and then casting in the young guys, McGreevy, Palante, and then having some more depth behind them too in AAA, that'll do a lot from an aesthetic standpoint and an outside view of the organization.
Yeah. This is a little off the cuff, unplanned here, but the question just hit me. If not Palante or McGreevy, is there any like rookie or near rookie, like young contributor, maybe on a pre-arb contract, who do you think is going to throw the most innings, especially out of the rotation? Do you think there's a Roberto maybe that emerges, or a Graceffo, or someone we're not talking about yet?
So Graceffo is the guy that jumps off the page, right? This is the year for Graceffo where he's got to it's got to go or not go. It feels like, right? Like this is sort of, you're getting to the point with him where if it doesn't get off the launch pad, then maybe it's not going to get off the launch pad. Zach Thompson is out of options. I don't really have a good feel for what that looks like. I think that it's well within the realm of possibility that when the Cardinals set the 40-man ahead of the Rule 5 here over the next couple of weeks, that Zach Thompson finds himself outrighted just because he doesn't have options. He didn't pitch really well at Memphis last year. I don't, and maybe not, but I know that does not appear to be working out all that well. Drew Rom coming off of shoulder surgery, who knows? That's a guy who they clearly valued at least a little when they traded for him. We'll see. Maybe after surgery he picks up, and we'll see what that looks like. The other guy that I'm going to plant the flag in, because he's pitched well in the AFL and he is 25 and has a whole bunch of minor league starts, is Trent Baker. I don't know, but that's a guy who, again, probably not a guy where like the ceiling is super high, but that is a guy who I could definitely envision being at least part of the conversation as we get to spring and especially kind of as the year goes on. If he pitches well at Memphis, I can see him being a guy who gets consideration as well, just because he's been in the system for a while. Again, he's I think he plays next year at 26. And they cared enough to give him an AFL spot, which says to me that there are something there that they do want to take a look at. And so that is a guy who I think is worth at least learning a little bit about as spring gets going.
Anyone you want to monitor, Thomas?
You pretty much said all the guys I was thinking too. Some of the lower level guys, maybe not innings leaders as far as surprise candidates, but Max Rajic would be a nice addition. I've loved Cooper Jerpy for the last few years as well. They're AA, AAA fringe guys. Yeah, so they're looking for Jerpy to get some serious innings under his belt before they do anything else as far as calling up to the majors. But they're names to watch, at least for like the next level of starting pitchers, the next round after we see like Quinn Matthews and Tink Hence. They're the next step of guys who could be reliable.
And we should also say too that Tink Hence and Tekoa Roby are both Rule 5 eligible this winter, right? So those are guys that are going to go on the 40-man. And if they're on the 40-man, they are at least going to be considered for possibly, when you look at the 40-man for this year, Sim Robertson was the only guy who was on the 40-man the entire year and did not make it to the big leagues. So if you're on that 40-man roster, there's a pretty good assumption, or there's a pretty good chance at least, that you are going to be involved in those conversations over the long run. And so those two guys also do stand out.
Yeah.
I think Tink would be a great late season, throw him in the bullpen, just let it rip for 30 days, see what he can do with max effort at the end of the season, assuming he's healthy. Get him his 75 innings in AAA, Springfield, wherever he wants to log those innings. Bring him up for the last month and just let him rip. Get him familiar with the pitching staff, get him familiar with the major league feel, and then that can lean into 2025 as a rotation spot for him.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that if the Cardinals are in any sort of contention. But I think I just would love to see from Tink Hence, like I'd love to see him maintain velocity between starts. I would love to see him not deal with fatigue, especially after starts where he pitches into the seventh. Like the Cardinals need to see him get some volume. We've talked about it a little bit on Birds on the Farm, which is a similar podcast to this for viewers. You should totally check it out. It's on our YouTube channel. We get into the system, the nitty gritty of it with Kareem. But the concern with Tink Hence is that there's potentially reliever concern. If he can't maintain his velocity past the fourth or fifth inning, if we see these drops, if it's hard for him to get on the mound every fifth day, there's a worry that he could potentially end up as a reliever. And so I would love to see the Cardinals exercise caution with him, but also they got to get him some volume. So maybe I'm a little hesitant to give him a bullpen role, but if the team's contending and you need that high octane arm, then I get it.
I do think there's an interesting parallel to be drawn between Hence and Ryan Helsley, who also had kind of an uneven development path just because he also was not healthy all of the time. And Helsley turned out to be a dominant reliever, which has a lot of value. It's not like a number 2 starter, which you would be hopeful that you could have gotten at that spot in the draft, but it's not. That's still a really good player who helps your big league team, right? This is a conversation that is also true of Matthew Liberatore. Maybe he's not going to be a frontline starter, but if he's Andrew Miller, that's still a really good player who helps a big league team. It's just, it's not maybe what you wanted, but you shouldn't. What did they say? Don't let perfect be the enemy of good, right? There is a way to look at it that way.
Yeah. Speaking of Ryan Helsley, and this will kind of get us into our next discussion here, where we're going to go through different trade candidates. I think the most important question with Helsley: does he have starter value? We've talked about it. I know Josh has been banging the Ryan Helsley should start drum for quite a while. Do you think there's any chance, if the Cardinals hang on to him, that he gets a look in the rotation? I think they should. I think he's one of the most talented arms in the system. He's got at least 2 like wipeout pitches, could probably have a third if he had to. And I think that's a guy who could be a really, really good starter, potentially a number 2 starter, something the Cardinals haven't had in a long time. And he could be had much more cheaply than some of these other options.
If they're going to do that, they need to tell him now rather than the Matthew Liberatore treatment over the last 3 years. He needs a full offseason to prepare himself to be a starter. To me, it feels too little too late. If they wanted to make him a starter, it should have been 2 years ago. It should have been when we saw the cracks in our pitching development, and we have this guy who's a reliever, who's surefire, who has these pitches we know about, and then they should have made him a starter then. As far as his trade value, I don't quite know if anybody else is looking at him as a potential starting pitcher. I think they see him as one of the top 3 closers in baseball.
For sure.
That's what they're getting out of him, especially since he's on his last year on a contract.
For sure.
Yeah, it's been 6 years since Helsley started on a regular basis, right?
Yeah.
That's
a long time.
tough. And look, he's a year away from free agency, and if he gets through this next season healthy, is anything close to what he was this past season,
he's getting a lot of money.
He's going to probably get the biggest closer deal, right? Like, the Diaz deal was 105, the Hader deal was less, but present day value, yada yada yada. I think in a year from now, we're talking about, is Ryan Helsley like a 6 and 120 guy in free agency?
Wow.
And maybe that's high, but if that's the case and you're him, that's a tough gamble. If anything even close to that is a year away, to go, you know what, actually, yeah, this is the year that I'm going to try to start. And then, oops, he blows out in May. That's a really tough spot. It's just from the practical sense of running an organization, that's a big ask for a guy, for a non-contending team. I have a tough time imagining that happening.
I agree.
I think what I'd prefer is over us turning him into a starter. Trading is probably number 1. And then I think between starter and trading, it should be us working out an extension with him. Jeff just alluded to it. There's no way he says yes to that. If he's going to get 100 million plus, assuming he has another even 40 save season, he has no business accepting an extension from the Cardinals for less than that, unless they can meet it or get close to it. But I would prefer an extension over turning him into a starter. I just don't think there's the time for it. There's not much of a need for it. We just talked about the plethora of potential starters we have, and that's without accepting options on guys. His best value for us, both as a player and as a trade piece, is as a closer.
Yeah, I think if you were going to start him, you would have to extend him. But if you could get you're not going to get the Ronaldo Lopez deal. Like, that's super low. But if you could get something that resembled that deal, if you're talking like, I don't know, 5 and 85, for example, like, I think that's less than Helsley will get. But if you were talking about something in that range, I'd be really interested in letting him be a starter, because that'd be incredible value for someone with his arm, his talent. But you never know if you're going to get that. So, Jeff, what do you think the odds are the Cardinals do trade Ryan Helsley this offseason?
I think that they're probably pretty high. I think that when you kind of look at, all the guys that are on the 40-man, is he the most likely player to be traded this winter? You could probably make that argument, just in terms of he's never going to have more value probably than he has right now. Maybe you get to the deadline next year, but you're always gambling with the health of any pitchers, let alone relievers, let alone a guy who has an injury history. So, I think he is a guy, again, if you're not going to be like, if competing is not your number one concern, that's a guy that makes all the sense in the world to me to be a trade piece. And I would be pretty surprised if they weren't having those conversations.
Yeah, he should probably be the most interested traded player out there. You're gambling with his health, but then you're also gambling with his performance. There's 2 very volatile things in baseball. 1 is a high school pitcher, and 2 is any reliever. And he falls into the second bucket. So his value is as high as it will ever be right now. if you're going to trade anybody to cut costs, he's going to be about $7 million next year, could even reach $8-9 million through arbitration. Now is the time to trade him and get as much of a package you can. I've seen people throw out 2 top 100 prospects. You're not going to get that from a closer with 1 year.
Maybe
you're going to get one and then a throw in lower, like lottery ticket type prospect who's a 19-year-old that was just drafted out of Dominican Republic or something. But to get a 2 top 100 prospects from any organization, that's not realistic.
Yeah, the nice thing about Helsley is, as a top 3 closer in the league, a guy that's now done it multiple years. He's got a decent track record of health. I know he was hurt in 2023 quite a bit, but I think that was also the Cardinals recognizing, look, it's a lost season. We don't need to rehab him super quickly. Right. We don't need to risk him. He's proven that no reliever is immune to reliever volatility. But some of them, I guess, stave it off as best they can. Clase comes to mind. Helsley comes to mind. He's in that elite group of relievers. And there's not a single team in the league that doesn't benefit by adding Ryan Helsley. I think that's a really good thing for the Cardinals. They're going to be able to find a trade partner. I'm with you guys. I personally think he's as good as gone. I think Cardinals fans should not expect Ryan Helsley to be on the roster on opening day. It's a bummer. He's one of the most talented arms the system's produced in a long time. Hopefully he'll bring back a hefty return. Coming up here, we're going to get into the end of the show here. So we're going to go through a couple more guys, probably not as in-depth as Ryan Helsley. I know we're getting right up against an hour here, but we just want some quick hitters. So maybe throw out a percentage chance that you think they'll be traded, defend it for maybe 15 to 30 seconds, and then we'll just move to the next guy. So we'll go Jeff first, then Thomas, you can respond to each of these. We've already done Ryan Helsley, so let's talk about Sonny Gray. Do you think he's traded? Do you think he's on the team? Give me a percentage here.
If I'm going to spitball a percentage, I will say 30% chance that he is traded. I think the thing with Gray is that the deal is heavily backloaded. He has a no trade clause, so he controls destination.
100%.
And when you look at where, we know that he got really close with someone else in free agency last winter before the Cardinals came in last minute. I think that it's fair to infer that team was probably Cincinnati, just based on broader reporting and kind of what they were after.
Wow.
That's a hard trade to make because if you're the Reds, it's tough to trade quality prospects in division. The Cardinals probably would not care about trading Gray in division, just sort of based on where they are in the competitive cycle. But if you're the Reds, that's tough ask to want to trade good prospects in division for a number of years. And so if it's not there, are you talking about Atlanta? Are you talking about, Baltimore? Like it's tough for me to see a whole lot of fit. It's not to me, it is not obvious what that deal looks like. And the only way that it gets done, the clearest way it gets done is if Gray asks out and is really open-minded about where he wants to go. And I'm not at all convinced that he would be.
Agreed.
30 was the number that came to my mind. And then I thought a little bit more and I got down to like 15 to 20% of him being traded, just with all the complicating factors. I don't think that there'll be many teams that A, want to take on his salary, and B, will be able to meet whatever balance of a trade that the Cardinals are seeking here. Reds and Braves feel like the 2 most likely candidates, strictly because he wants to stay close to his home in Nashville.
Yep.
He's familiar with Cincinnati, so it's a little bit more of a distance, but he's still familiar with it. And so I think those are the 2 teams that he'd have interest in going to. It all depends on who's willing to take his money and if he's going to accept any trades like that.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I just don't think he wants to be traded. I know Sonny Gray really wanted to be in St. Louis. He likes it here. It's really close to Nashville. And obviously that's where he wants to be when he's not in St. Louis. Anywhere else away from there, probably not what he wants. So I think I'm somewhere around you guys, probably about 30%, because who wouldn't want to go to a contender? He's probably not going to win a lot of games in St. Louis next year. He might, but there's a chance that things go off the rails. After Helsley and Gray, we've got Nolan Arenado. This is a tough one. I think there's a world in which the Cardinals trade him. I also think it's going to be really hard to get that deal done. So, Jeff, what do you think about Arenado potentially being moved?
Yeah, I'll say 50%.
Because
nice. Truly, it's binary. If he wants to go, he'll go, and if he doesn't, he won't. Like they will be able to figure out a deal for him. Again, not super easy to figure out what that match looks like because I'm fairly confident that Arenado probably doesn't want New York, and so you're talking about the West Coast. We'll see what that looks like. Is that Arizona? Is that the Dodgers? I don't really know. The one that does stand out to me is the Phillies. He has a lot of connections with guys on that team. He definitely that's a team that's trying to win right now, a team that could definitely use him that stands out to me. And the other one, too, that I would mention is Houston. Assuming that Bregman does go elsewhere in free agency, that is, and this is also true of Paul Goldschmidt to an extent. Houston now is not run the same way Houston was run 3, 4, 5 years ago, right? Houston now is the owner and Jeff Bagwell picking up dudes to some extent. And I could very much see Arenado being a guy who appeals to them kind of on that basis. Setting aside the fact that he was still an elite defender at third last season. He did bounce back into that. The offense obviously was pretty dreadful all year long, but he does definitely still have value. And in a ballpark like Philly, like Houston, where the ball kind of jumps, I can see there being benefit there.
I think 50% is very reasonable. I would imagine Arenado is the player the Cardinals would like to get rid of the most out of all
I would
this,
agree with that.
Lots
of
his financials. They have other players who can transition over to third. Maybe not the most player that they most want to get rid of, but he's probably between Gray and Arenado and Contreras, those three alone. I think that Arenado is probably the guy that the Cardinals would be like, yeah, okay, that's fine. We'll trade you off. But it all depends on who he wants to go to. He and Gray are probably picky for two different reasons. Gray is picky for close to home and a relative competitive window. Arenado is probably more picky for like, who do I know there? How can I fit into their mold? Just because he's a third baseman, there's only one third baseman playing. You can have 5 starting pitchers in rotation, and the balance is a little bit different. But I'd say Arenado's 50-50 as to whether or not he's traded.
That's a good point. You mentioned Contreras. Let's just go straight to him. I think trading Contreras, he's an elite bat when he's healthy. When he actually played this year and last year, he was unbelievable. Almost a 150 WRC plus guy. Clearly the best bat on the team right now, especially with Goldie and Arenado trending down over the last 2 seasons or so. But moving that bat, you could get a lot back, especially because he can play catcher, and he was a good defensive catcher when he was on the field this year. The problem is if you move that bat, the offense could go from bad to really, really bad.
Yeah, to me, Contreras is in that gray neighborhood of 30-ish%. Again, you have to find the match. He has to be willing to go because he has control over that as well. We know from recent history that the last time that Willson Contreras was really available in the trade market in 22, there was not a ton of interest. The one team that was interested then and that also pursued him in free agency again was Houston. That was all around that. I think, somewhat famously, the Astros had a deal worked out for Contreras, and Dusty Baker stuck his neck out and said that he wanted Maldonado, and then the deal didn't happen. And that's why Contreras didn't get traded at the deadline out from the Cubs in 22. So, does Houston revisit that? Does Willson want to do that? Does Willson want to go to a spot if the team where he's being traded to says, we'd love to have you as a DH, but you're not going to catch? How does he feel about that? Who's to say? I think there are a lot of things that go into that that make it harder to trade Contreras. He's also Contreras. I think behind Gray owed the second most of these guys too. He's actually owed a tick more than Arenado just based on the offset from Colorado and some of those deferments as well.
Yeah, he's the second most expensive of the bunch, but even his salary for what he provides isn't too much compared to other catchers, even it's DHs.
No,
I mean, you look at Yordan Alvarez's extension, how much he's getting owed, Giancarlo Stanton, and their production are as DHs. Contreras is right there with them as far as production, and even better. I mean, look at Stanton's numbers this last year. He's probably right around that gray 25% area. For the same reasons as the other two. Can we find a willing partner, and will the player accept it? I would love to keep Contreras. However, we have so many catchers that and then potential first baseman to fill in there, and then they use the DH as a rotating break day. Do they have a dedicated DH? There's so many questions there. So trading Contreras would make the rest of the roster decisions much easier than it would be with Gray or Arenado. You have Pages, you have Herrera, you have Jimmy Crooks, who's probably a year away. You could even get some time at the end of this year. Those are all very viable catchers that could work as a platoon or even by themselves, assuming Herrera makes the defensive adjustments and Pages stays 60% as an offensive hitter.
Yeah. We're going to close right here by just pick one of the 3 pitchers who you think is most likely to get rid of. I'd love to see him get rid of 2 of these guys. I'm not sure that's possible. But we'll just go with Matt's, Fedde, Michaelis. Pick one that you think is gone. If it's Eric Fedde, I think that's the most logical to go. So maybe pick a second most likely as well if you're picking him. But give us a sense of who's going to move on in that group.
I would say we'll call it 95% one of Fetty or Matz, right?
Agreed.
I think, neither of them can block a deal. Matz has 1 year left. It's 12 million, I think. Matz also has proof of concept as a reliever. So if you're a team that doesn't think he can stand up to starting, but thinks that he can help you from the bullpen, he's an expensive reliever for 1 year, but he's a pretty good reliever for 1 year. And again, it's only the 1 year. And so, to me, as a left-hander as well, that's a guy who is going to have some appeal out on the trade market. The other thing that I would say about Eric Fetty, and at the time, it was a funny joke, but I do think it's worth flagging. After his last start, he was kind of asked, "Hey, you have a contract for next year. How do you take Bob? How your first year went?" And he cracked a joke and he said, "Well, I got to get through the winter meetings first," which is a good joke. But frankly, also is at the time of year when he would have already been having kind of his exits, right? They'd have been having conversations. And so is it totally impossible that at the end of September, Eric Fetty had already been given the heads up, hey, look, this could happen? No, that's not impossible. That would very much kind of be, be their MO. That would be kind of how that would work, right? So I do think it's worth flagging that Fetty was the guy who broached that as a possibility, himself kind of spontaneously at the end of the season. But no, I do think bottom line, I would be really, really surprised if both of those guys were in camp when camp opened. Michaelis,
who knows?
Michaelis is it's the Marlins or it's no one. Honestly, is sort of what that feels like to me. And it's the Marlins, Cardinals eating a big piece of cash.
Yeah.
And I don't know how eager they're going to be to do that. I don't know how you trade a guy who's been arguably the worst starter in baseball over the last 2 years, who's still owed $19 million next year. I don't know how you do that. Unless it's you stay, and the guy, by the way, who's 10-5 and who also he has a full no trade clause as well. Or he doesn't have 10 years, but he has no trade clause in his deal. So unless you're stapling him to a fairly good prospect and eating money to trade him somewhere else, I have a hard time. It's going to be really hard. That's one to me, the more likely outcome. If he doesn't finish the season with the Cardinals next year, it's going to be because they got the June 1st and it still looks like what it looked like, and they cut the check and say thank you for your service.
Oof, yeah.
I want Michaelis gone the most, but he's the least likely to go. No trade clause, very expensive and very bad. Those all go against him and the Cardinals in a trade. Yeah. The Matz versus Fetty, one of them will be gone as well. I agree. I think Fetty's the more likely of the two, but I also think Matz still provides value as a swingman, bullpen guy who could go out and start for you if you have an injury. Fetty is the higher value starting pitcher, though, and he's half of Matz's salary, a little bit over that, and so that makes him very easy to trade.
Yeah. Well, the Cardinals have a lot of decisions to make in the coming days. 5 days from the end of the World Series, which hopefully drags out a little longer. It's been kind of boring so far, seeing the Yankees do very little to stop the Dodgers, Andrews Dodgers, might I add, which is so tough around here. But it's been tough seeing them do very little. But 5 days from then, the Cardinals have to make decisions on Middleton, Gibson, and Lynn. And then obviously the winter meetings, a long offseason ahead, tons of change in the front office, the major league staff, and on the field. But we'll be covering all of that right here on Deal in the Cards. So make sure to catch us. Thanks again for joining us, Jeff and Thomas. It was great to have you on. We hope to have you guys on in the near future. And we'll see everybody next time. Thanks again.